Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Growing Generations podcast show. I'm your host, Emmanuel Arce, well known as the Ultimate Gardener. I'm a 17-year-old agriculturist here in Southern Florida, and I started a podcast show here on Growing Generations podcast. And on this podcast, all we focus on is featuring other amazing gardeners that have great passion and enthusiasm in the garden industry and that focus in different branches. We're not talking about simple, basic growing your vegetables type gardeners. We're talking about other gardeners who have years of experience in this industry and have learned a lot through their journey, and they are on YouTube or on media to teach others on how to improve their gardening journey. And so for this week's episode, we are on episode number 5. Last week, we were with Kate Ketchell from Late Bloomer Garden Show discussing about gardening on a homestead. And so now we'll be discussing about raised bed gardening with a very good friend of mine, Scott Wilson from Gardener Scott. I have collaborated with him many times in the past, and so I decided to bring him back on the show to discuss all about raised bed gardening since that's something he really likes doing. So we'll be discussing everything about how to start one, how to maintain it, how to fill it up. Every questions you guys have, feel free to leave them in the comments section for us to answer in the live stream and us to answer your questions as well. So let's go ahead and jump into this episode, and let's go ahead and welcome Scott from Gardener Scott.
Hi, Emmanuel. How are you?
Hi, sir. I'm great. How are you? How's everything over there in Colorado?
It's great. It's a little cold right now, but that's expected for the end of February.
Yeah, definitely. Especially since we share two different climates as we were discussing before we went on air. He lives in Colorado, I live in Southern Florida. He currently is in cold temperatures right now, and I'm in 75-degree weather. We're chilling, sitting back. Some people are even going to the beach at this time. And so we have two different climates. And so something I always look for is to have another perspective on the topics we discuss. For example, Gardner Scott lives in a more well-known zone where he's able to experience all 4 seasons, and that's something that lots of gardeners may experience, or the majority of gardeners are experiencing, to wonder what to do during cold periods of times, and hot periods of time. So that's what we're here to discuss about. And so, as I mentioned before, we were going to discuss all about raised bed gardening. Since I have done raised bed gardening, I'm not the best at it because I prefer amending my soil and planting my plants in the ground. However, I know, Scott, that you do lots of raised bed gardening. So, going all the way back to how you started your gardening journey. So, first question out there is, how did you begin your gardening journey in your garden?
So I've really been most focused on gardening for about the last 20 years. It was over 30 years ago, I kind of dabbled with a garden like a lot of people do, just a few beds. They were all in-ground beds, and I just kind of learned as I moved around. And then about 20 years ago, a little more than that, here in Colorado, I really became serious about gardening. I became a Colorado master gardener in 2004. And one of the things that I never really knew much until moving to Colorado was how important soil is in the garden. I lived in California, had relatives in California growing up, and you could just put a seed in the ground and it would grow. And I just had assumed everybody could do that. But the soil in Colorado is so bad and so poor that you can't grow in the ground. There are no farms within 50 miles of where I live because the soil is just so bad. And so that got me focused on what I needed to do to grow plants, which was to start raised bed gardening, because it's a lot easier to build a bed and fill it with good soil than it is to take terrible soil and try to spend years improving it to the point that you can grow.
Yeah, definitely. Something I really much agree with. Although here in Southern Florida, our seeds grow and germinate like wildfire. However, something lots of gardeners here in Southern Florida don't understand is that we have very sandy soil. The seeds, although they might germinate in the beginning, they do need another medium to grow in order to properly grow. Because water just drains through. No
Sure.
nutrients, no nothing is hold back. So you have to add supplemental fertilizers or organic compost or amend your soil before planting your seeds, because then that will allow you to have a better success at starting seeds in the ground. Or in my case especially, we can't grow root crops because here in Florida, our soil has to be deeply amended before we plant any root crops, which is what I was discussing before we aired with Scott. That I have to do a whole process before planting out in the garden. So that's why a lot of gardeners gravitate towards raised bed gardening, because you're able to put the soil in, you're able to decide what your plants are growing in. And so, one thing that I heard a lot of when it comes to raised bed gardening is, how do you fill your raised beds up? Because I know there's other, like the newer ones that have come out was the metallic galvanized container styled raised beds, like from birdies, etc. And those are some really deep raised beds, and it's going to be pretty costly to fill that entire thing up with soil. So from your experience, Scott, what would you say would be the best approach when it comes to filling up your raised bed gardening? What amendments you should use, if you should use compost, anything like that. What would you recommend for the beginner gardener or any gardener looking into raised bed gardening?
Well, first off, it depends on the size of the bed, how deep the bed is. And then, secondly, gardeners should be looking at what they want to grow in their beds. And so, most of the vegetable garden plants that we grow can do very well with soil that's 8 to 12 inches deep. And so, if you have a short raised bed that's only 10 or 12 inches tall, then you would fill the whole thing with a good amended rich soil, either something that you buy or something you make yourself, but the whole bed needs to be soil because that's how deep the roots are going to grow. But for those deeper beds, yeah, some of those metal beds that are being sold now are 32 inches deep. I have some that are 17 inches. In addition to, I've got 32-inch deep metal beds. And you don't need that much soil for our vegetable garden plants to grow into. You still need to focus on that 10 to 12 inches at the surface for the plants. Below that, you've got a lot of options. And so I encourage, and I've got some videos that show how I fill my raised beds that are deep like that. I'll take tree branches and wood chips and leaves and straw and grass from the lawn after mowing. Basically, just try to fill the base with as much organic matter as possible, recognizing that some of those logs are going to take years to decompose and break down, but that's not a problem because they're adding nutrients to the soil. As they decompose, the fungi, the earthworms, the arthropods, everything that's in the soil will be feeding deep down in the soil and enriching that lower soil. So my terrible soil here in Colorado, I will fill my bottom of the beds with tree branches and my terrible soil, and then some wood chips and my terrible soil, and some crushed leaves and my terrible soil. And years from now, all of that lower level will become rich soil. And I only need to buy or make that top portion of the bed suitable for plants right now. And then in years to come, every year I like to amend my beds. I'll add compost to the top, work it into the top few inches. And so when you fill the bottom with organic matter and then you add organic matter to the top, you basically are enriching your soil from below and above, and it can really make for a good, healthy environment that plants grow into.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that as well, because when it comes to raised bed gardening, That's a pretty deep metallic bed that you're working with, and to fill that up with pure soil, that's a good penny that you'll be spending there.
Yep.
That's what I would recommend as well. What Scott would say: fill it up with some type of organic matter that will naturally decompose and add nutrients into your soil, and then add about 10 inches to 15 of the surface of your soil you buy at the store, and amend that on the top as well, because I know some gardeners are like, yeah, but if I put the organic matter at the bottom, won't the nutrients just stay in the bottom? Well, something that we say is to not only add organic matter in the bottom, but add organic matter at the top as well and mix that into it. So that's the best soil to grow in there, because plants like your basic vegetables or root crops, some of them are very heavy feeders, especially your root crops like your onions and potatoes. They require a good amount of nutrients in order to properly or abundantly perform. And so, definitely by adding organic matter is the best way to go, since that's how much they could feed off of, and you'll be able to provide it naturally. And so, that's definitely something I would agree with when it comes to raised bed gardening. Now, moving on to the best crops to grow in raised bed gardening. I know you could grow every crop out there in a raised bed. However, what I've realized here in Florida or with my raised beds, I don't know if it's the same with you, Scott, that some species of veggies prefer to be planted in the ground. Some perform best in the raised bed container. In your journey with raised bed gardening or with your experiences, what would have been your top best performing vegetables in raised bed gardening?
Yeah, beyond a doubt, tomatoes and peppers and squash do incredibly well in raised beds because you can design your soil. You can have that really good, rich soil. And the nice thing about raised beds is you can really focus the growing within each bed so that you match the soil with whatever plant you're growing, and you make sure that it's well draining, and you make sure it's got all the nutrition. And it's just so easy for most of the vegetable garden plants that we're growing in raised beds, especially like in my region. I've just got such a dense, poor soil. Growing carrots and most root crops, just they don't do well in the ground, but they do incredibly well in the nice, loose, rich raised bed soil. And so I grow pretty much everything in my garden in raised beds, except plants like corn. Corn, for instance, needs a lot of space, and it doesn't necessarily need a raised bed, especially when it comes to how much space a good corn crop should have. I think that's one that it'll grow in a raised bed, but you don't necessarily need to waste the raised bed space for a crop like that. And watermelons, I can't grow very many melon varieties here in Colorado, but for plants like that that spread a lot and take up a lot of space, those do well in ground beds so that they can sprawl, so that they can spread. Pumpkins are like that. I grow pumpkins, but I don't grow pumpkins in my raised beds. I grow pumpkins in the ground so they can spread on the outside of my raised beds. But other than, those type of plants, you can do anything in a raised bed garden.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. Which when it comes to your vining crops or your corn, those are best grown in the ground unless it's like a vining crop like peas or pole beans. Then if you install a trellis system, then you could grow them in the raised bed. However, anything like your vining squash, your watermelons, your melons, anything like that, I've seen best perform in the ground since they have more space. And ideally, like something that I've come to realization is companion planting with the three sisters, which those are meant to grow in the ground because you have your vine, your corn, and then that's meant to be planted in the ground to maximize your gardening space. I know you can do companion gardening or companion planting in raised beds, which is the whole ideal of it, to maximize your gardening space, plant as much veggies as you can in the same bed. But when it comes to those certain species of vegetables like your corn and stuff like that, I would definitely consider those in the ground and not in the raised bed, because like how Scott mentioned, that would just be wasting this raised bed, because they don't necessarily need that amount of depth, let alone space, for them to properly grow. And I definitely agree, like peppers and tomatoes and anything like that works best in the raised bed. What I came to realize is bush beans or green beans or your regular lettuce, those do great in raised beds as well. And so if you're a beginner gardener going into raised bed gardening, definitely go with your tomatoes, your squash, your bush beans, your basic vegetables like that. There are one-time vegetables. Plant them in your raised beds or to expect a better outcome from it. And so, let's see. Okay, I think we have a question here. Or is that Jay to someone else? No, that's Jay to someone else. All right. So for another question is what to doing during the winter, because I know with raised bed gardening here in Florida, we plant it all year round. Once a crop is done, we replace it with something else. We move forward. However, I know in other places like Colorado, you have a winter period. You have snow. You have stuff like that. And so, what will in your occasion, Scott, when it comes to your raised beds, what do you do during the winter? Because I know some people do like a greenhouse effect where they put like plastic over them to elongate what they're growing in it. But I haven't really tried that myself because I'm not in the need of using it. But for winter, how do you take care of your raised beds during the winter, and what do you do with them?
Yeah, I like to amend my beds in fall. And so at the end of the season, when the cold weather hits and all the tomatoes and peppers and squash and melons have died or are getting close to dying because the forecast is going to be so cold, that's when I like to amend my beds, adding compost and organic matter to the soil. And that allows a lot of time. The thing about amending is it doesn't give an immediate impact on the beds. That organic matter needs to be decomposed to release the nutrients that the plants need, and that takes time. So by doing that in fall, I have all of those autumn months and the winter months, and then the spring, early spring months for the microbes in the soil to make those nutrients available to the plants. And that sets me up for winter. So I'm doing that typically in September or October. And if you look at nature, you'll see that nature doesn't like bare soil. There's always leaves or plants or something that's covering the soil. And we should do the same thing in our gardens, especially in a raised bed. If you leave your soil bare over the winter, the sun's UV rays can kill some of those microorganisms in the soil. The wind can blow some of it away. Water and erosion can possibly happen. So I like to at least use a mulch to cover the soil in my beds. And that mulch will also eventually break down because it's organic mulch like straw and crushed leaves and dried grass. And that protects the soil during the course of the winter. But cover crops as well. Growing plants during that fall period. So I'll amend, I'll seed plants like hairy vetch or a winter pea, those kind of plants that will grow when it's still a little bit cool. And then they will either go dormant or they'll die over the course of the winter. And then come springtime, I'll clear out those plants and either turn them into the soil or add them to my compost pile. And the soil is rich and ready and plants can start growing.
Yeah, I definitely agree when it comes to amending wise. When you hear amending, it's not just adding industrialized fertilizers or fertilizer in general into your soil. That's not what we only mean by amending, because what we want to focus on is just natural organic amending, which can be like Scott mentioned, mulching your raised beds or even your in-ground plantings with leaves or straw or wood chips. Here in Florida, like here in the background, this landscape that I designed back here, We mulched everything with wood chips because it naturally decomposes and it amends your soil. So amending is not just plopping fertilizers in your soil to feed your plants. What we mean is to naturally amend them with decomposable material like compost. Something I find very useful is earthworm castings as well. I call it the black gold because that's straight up nutrients you're giving your plants. And so amending is not just applying fertilizers into your soil to improve the nutrients, if not to improve it as general. Because over here in Florida, I don't know how the soil looks over there in Colorado. For us, it's very gray. The sand all just floats on top, so it doesn't look very pleasing to the eye. So what we do is we add mulch on top, so it suppresses the sand from being visual, and whenever it decomposes, it turns the soil into this deep, rich brown color, which is what we're looking for. And so I did see a comment from the Urban Gardener. Hi, Enoch. Thank you so much for joining us about Squarespace gardening. So he asked, I find that using Squarespace gardening method for raised beds and containers works really well for maximizing my growing space. What do you think?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, uh, Mel Bartholomew, about 30 years ago now, I think, wrote a book called Square Foot Gardening that really started the idea of thinking of our beds as grids. And within each of those square spaces within our beds, we grow whatever plants we want to grow. Like I said earlier, you can grow just about everything in a raised bed. So one square might be carrots. And so in a square foot of carrots, you could grow 36 individual carrots. You space them about 2 inches apart in a block pattern, and you've got 36 carrots in one square. And then the next square, you might be growing lettuce. And so you might have 4 heads of lettuce in that next square. And you do that throughout the entire bed. It's a great way to pack a lot of plants into a small space. Very advisable. The biggest problem with it is it takes planning. You have to figure out how many plants will fit in each of those squares. I don't think that's a problem. I think the result of having so many plants and so many harvests makes it worth that extra effort. But there's math involved, there's planning involved, and I know that at least some of the times when I've done it, I have my plan, I'll go out, and after doing one square of carrots, I realize I've got too many squares of lettuce. You can be flexible as long as you know what is going to go in one square. When I'm actually sowing the seeds, I'll change my mind. And so instead of growing 4 more lettuce plants, I'll grow 36 more carrot plants. That's okay. That's regular part of gardening, is modifying your plan. But to get to that point, you kind of have to have a good idea of what you can fit in a space. And some of the recommendations I think are a little bit faulty. I've seen some recommendations saying that you can grow 1 tomato plant in every square foot. Well, I think that's a little bit close. Tomatoes really do benefit if they have more space. So that's where experience comes in, but give it a try. And Enoch is an experienced enough gardener that it's just a matter of doing that planning and that prep. But I think all gardeners have that ability if they just take the effort.
I definitely agree with that as well. I know something that a lot of people ask me is, why don't you design and lay out your garden and then plant it and call it a day? Well, as a gardener, pretty sure you know as well, if we design something, if we sit down and design something for our landscape, by the time we're doing it, it's a completely different design.
That's
And
right.
so, like I always say, a garden is never finished. If a gardener says my garden's finished, then they got some rethinking to do, because the garden's always going to evolve. My garden has evolved over 20 times in the almost 10 years I've been gardening in my backyard. And so it has been an evolving journey. You will lose plants, you'll kill plants, you'll have successes. it's totally up to how many years you have underneath your belt. Because I know something like that I mentioned last live stream is lots of gardeners are like, they kill one plant, like a succulent or like a orchid. They'll be like, I'm not a green thumb, I'm a black thumb, I don't want to do it. Well, they haven't really dived into the garden industry like how they should have, and they haven't expanded their creativity, I would per se, or their ability to garden, because everybody can do gardening. Gardening is the simplest hobby out there. You grow, you dedicate a certain area, plant your vegetables, harvest your organic produce from it, and you'll have delight doing it. That's what I'm doing it. I am in school right now to study agriculture, and I'm going to major in agricultural science
Nice.
for the state of Florida. And so it totally depends on what you prefer, because if you're a more ornamental gardener and you only like flowers, do your flower garden, do a cottage garden, do something you like. However, if you're like myself and Scott, we like to grow our own food. We like to expand to see what we can grow in our backyard and supply our own lunches and dinners for the day. And so that's what we like. However, you can always adjust it to what you prefer. And so that's something I definitely agree when it comes to design wise or square foot gardening, because although square foot gardening might sound very like limited, you have endless opportunities when it comes to square foot gardening, because you're ultimately maximizing your gardening space so you could grow more than one crops and have a vast variety of veggies to harvest when they're ready.
And you
And
don't
so
have to
yeah,
grow just in 1 square increments.
yes,
You can have 4 square feet for a big zucchini plant, or you could use 6 square feet for 3 squash plants on a trellis. So I think that's a common misconception with that idea as well, is that you can only grow one type of plant in each
yeah.
square. But there's great flexibility, like you said. You can do lots of different things in lots of different ways. It's just a guideline to help with the planning.
I definitely agree with that, because it's not just limited to one species of veggie in 1 square foot. You could do lots of more in that square foot. And so another thing when it comes to raised bed gardening is something that I even would ask is about pest and disease. Although pest and disease, yeah, sure, they would only probably attack the plants. However, there is certain pests and diseases that can be found in the soil where they'll travel or stay once you treat your plants. Now, in those certain occasions, I know with regular containers, like your regular pots or your ornamental pots, what I would do is I would replace the soil completely, or yeah, I would replace the soil completely to make sure that I eliminate that disease or pest. Now, for raised bed gardening, you're speaking about a more bigger soil, a lot more soil that could be infested. And so, in this certain circumstance, what would be the best way to assure yourself you're eliminating the pest or disease that could possibly be in the surface of the soil, without like removing the soil entirely? Or if they have to remove the soil entirely, like what would you recommend?
So that's one of the biggest advantages, I think, to raised bed gardening, is because of each bed is its own individual garden space. You can isolate it, you can treat it, you can focus on whatever the problem happens to be with that bed in particular. And it's important to understand that pests target specific plants and diseases target specific plants. So there are very few pests and diseases that will kill everything. And so if you've got a squash vine borer problem in a particular bed because you were growing squash and that insect came in and laid eggs, and now you've got a pest in that bed, well, you can isolate that bed. You can put some hoops in place. You can cover it with a row fabric or a mesh screen to either keep the insects out or to keep the problem in and keep it from spreading to the rest of the garden. In in-ground gardens, it's really hard to isolate plants, but raised beds, just because of their basic design, are easy to cover, easy to isolate. And once you've identified whatever that pest or problem happens to be, you can use that to your advantage. So a squash vine borer is not going to cause a problem to tomatoes. So if you've got that insect this year in the soil in that bed, well, then don't grow squash in that bed next year. Next year, grow tomatoes in that bed. And when those insects emerge ready to eat, they've got nothing to eat. And you're going to be able to kill out the pests because you've looked at their life cycle and kept them from surviving because they're trapped in the bed and there's no food that they can eat. And the same holds true with diseases. If you got a carrot disease, then don't grow carrots in that bed for years ahead. Grow other types of plants that are not affected by that carrot disease. And eventually, the bacteria in the soil will consume all of those pathogens, and you won't have carrot problems anymore. And so typically 7 years is a real good safe number. If you have a disease in the soil, just avoid planting those same family of plants in that bed for 7 years, and you've eliminated the problem. Insect pests, after a single year, you might be able to eliminate the problem by just rotating your choice of crops and trying to break up the life cycle of that pest.
Yeah, I definitely agree because something I always see when it comes to gardening is they always have a pesticide or insecticide or a fungicide in hand. And so something that us gardeners are trying to enforce is our natural ways to control a pest or disease or a fungus that may have attacked your plants. And one of that ways is like what Scott has mentioned is by completely avoiding planting those plants for a good time period for that pest or disease to go away or be naturally consumed by the natural bacteria that's in the soil. Or other ways is by using like dish soap and water, or by using plant-based solutions, or by using. I've seen in one of Kay's videos that she had powdery mildew on her squash. This was years back when she was in California still. She used a milk and water based solution and it helped cure her powdery mildew on her squash. And so, not always the solution is to grab a pesticide or insecticide you get at your local big box store. If not, find ways you can naturally eliminate these disease and pests in your raised bed or even in your in-ground plantings in general, because that's what we want to kind of focus on. So let's see. Let's see what this person has mentioned. So, Growing Generation podcast and gardeners, Scott, the older we get, the more we go with easy of access, easy of maintenance. The taller raised beds were the blessing when I had extreme. Yes. That's
Yeah, that's one of the
something.
great things
Yeah.
about raised beds is you can build them to fit how you garden and what you need in your garden. And so the 32-inch tall metal beds may seem like it's too much, but a tall bed like that is ideal for people who have difficulty bending over, who want to be able to stand while they garden, who need that extra support, something to hold on to. And so designing your raised beds and using them, especially when you get older and start having some issues, I think that is yet again a great reason for having raised beds. I do most of my gardening sitting on the side of my beds because they're about 16 inches high, about the same height as a chair. And I can just sit and put seeds in the ground, pull weeds, do whatever I need to do without straining my back and bending and squatting. And designing is just so variable with raised beds that everyone should be taking advantage of that concept.
That's definitely something I agree with. Like I mentioned, adjust your gardening techniques to what you prefer or what you can do. A lot of raised bed gardening is done by lots of people who are not able or have the ability to completely bend back. Even me, who is like 17 years old, I'm young, I have lots of energy. It's tiring to be bending down for hours trying to fix your weed problem, treating, planting. That could get pretty tiring. And so raised bed gardening is something lots of people do as they get older in age, or if they want to have easier access or easier forms of gardening, they do raised bed gardening because it's more elevated. You don't have to be that bent down. I actually have a product here that a company has sent out to me that I'll be doing a video on today and releasing to the shorts side of things, is a kneeler. It's a garden kneeler that you're able to use. It's also a seat that allows you to be more comfortable while gardening. Always adjust your gardening technique or your garden to what you're able to do or what you prefer to do. It's not all about blood, sweat, and tears in that garden, busting your back and weeding and everything. It's gardening is supposed to be calming, relaxing. It's supposed to be fun at times. And so that's what you want to make sure you achieve when it comes to gardening with raised beds. And so if you guys have any more questions, this is the time to leave them in the live stream so we could go ahead and answer them. However, I do lots of my raised bed gardening in cloth pot containers. One of the companies I work with, Smart Pots, they provide some really cool cloth pot raised beds because the soil stays aerated, there's no compaction issues. However, there is other materials to use in raised beds. I've heard of wood, metal, I know there's plastic ones out there, there's cloth pot ones like I have. Out of all those, what would be your preferred raised bed gardening, whether it be for a beginner gardener or anything like that? What's the go-to raised bed material you would go for more of a longer lasting or more permanent, we'll put it into quotes, permanent raised bed?
And so for permanence, you really want to go with stone or concrete. So I have concrete block raised beds. I've got retaining wall blocks that I use for raised beds, and they're going to last for many, many, many years. They'll still be here after I'm long gone because that rock and that concrete is not going to break down. So that's a great option for longevity, and it's not that much more cost when you compare it to like some of the new raised bed kits that are made from metal. And so that's
Mm-hmm.
also a good option. The biggest difference I would say between what is available now in the metal raised beds and then what's available with a stone or concrete bed is the decorative aspect, how it looks in the garden. So I've got some great metal raised beds, and they come in different colors and different shapes and different heights. And so that's an advantage to the metal beds. As for what each gardener chooses, it's, do you want your garden to look good? Do you want your garden to last a long time? And cost is a factor. If cost is a consideration, I think reusing used boards is a great way to save money and build a bed. Now, though, that wood is going to break down and it's going to need to be replaced in time, but it's a great way to start a garden without spending a lot of money. The metal beds can be costly, and the stone and rock beds take some effort to build because it's heavy material. And so, depending on the abilities of the gardener and depending on their budget, I think really helps determine what is the best product to use.
I definitely agree with that. It's totally up to what you decide. If you want a pretty garden, you would probably go with more of a wood finish to it because those are the most prettiest raised beds out there. Or if you want more of a longevity raised bed that stays longer, I would definitely go with concrete or stepping stone, something that won't be replaced or will never be replaced while you're gardening. If you want more of a modern look to it or a more elevated type thing, you have your metal raised beds as well. It's totally depend on when your budget, the style you're looking for, and of course the area you're working with as well. Because when it comes to wood and the concrete, you're able to choose the size, your length, your width of your base beds. However, with these metal ones, I know they come in a more like set width and length, so you're able to have more creativity with wood and stepping stone. But it's totally up to how you feel is best. I know what the comment I pinned is saying, how some people use recycled old bathtubs as flower beds or herbs bed, which is another
Sure.
way you could definitely do that, which I have seen in the past. Lots of people were like recycling bicycles or um old laundry baskets. They find ways to minimize spending and maximize gardening. So that's definitely something I am really interested in. So that is gonna be the wrap up for episode 5 here at Growing Generations Podcast. Once again, we are just a starting podcast show. This is only episode 5, and so this is a completely new channel. Make sure to go ahead and subscribe to Gardener Scott. He's an amazing gardener over there in Colorado, and he always has new videos coming out to help you guys and guide you guys on your gardening journey. My personal page is Emmanuel Arce, the Ultimate Gardener. I mainly focus on food forestry or tropical gardening here in Southern Florida. That's mainly what I teach. It's totally up to what you would like to see. Both. Make sure to subscribe, both of us, on our main page. And make sure you're subscribed to here on the Growing Generations Podcast YouTube channel so you could get notified when we release a new episode. A huge shout out once again to you, Scott, for joining with us on this video. We would love to have you back to discuss a different topic. It was super, super fun, and thanks to everybody who has joined us on this live stream.
Thanks, Emmanuel. It was wonderful to be here, and I look forward to returning.
Yeah, so next week we have a completely new guest and a new topic to discuss about. And so that will be announced soon next week on Tuesday, since we go live every Tuesday at 5 a.m. p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So thank you all so much for joining us on episode 5, Raised Bed Gardening, here at Growing Generations Podcast. Make sure and remember, we are Growing Generations Podcast, and we are all about showcasing amazing gardeners on the show, as well as new fun techniques that may be hitting the garden industry. So thank you all so much for joining us, and we'll see you on next week's episode. Bye, everyone.